introduction, so let me just add a couple of things. So I am the sole organizer of our Juneteenth event at Goodman. I've been blessed to join a 30-year legacy of a citywide Juneteenth, and this year I was in charge of the parade and the teen tent, so both challenges within themselves. So I can't take credit for all of the Juneteenth festivities, but I definitely am a one-woman show for my own brunch. And then I thought that was very sweet about who everyone wants to go to, because I would guess that is not actually true. So just a little bit about myself, and then I want to just take a moment to find out a little bit about who's in the room. So I moved to Madison when I was 9 years old from a small Wisconsin community, Burlington, Wisconsin. Anybody who's familiar with that area? Mm-hmm. All right. And I was adopted at 6 weeks old by a Polish and a German couple. So my experience started out as literally the darkest person in the space. At the time, Burlington was about 4,000 and some odd folks. And I have an adopted brother who's older than me, who is what in our community we would call high yellow. So even though I'm a little bit lighter brown, I was absolutely the darkest complected person, and also the only person. So he's 4 years older than me, so I spent a lot of time in school as the only what we would call minority. I say minority just because I think if we look globally, that's not an accurate depiction. So there's a couple words that I reject. I reject African American a little bit. I refer to myself as black. If I wanted to get real deep with you, I would say that I'm black indigenous, mixed racially, and culturally black. What that means to me is that the community that I most associate with and that I raise my children to be part of is the black community. So at 9, we moved here to Madison because my older brother was starting to experience some very overt racism. Very athletic young man, and so middle school he was the one hitting the ball out of the park and knocking out those, every sport. He shined in every sport you could think of. But dating was also starting to happen. And there was that pushback from the parents who loved to have him on their softball, their baseball team, their basketball team out on the track, and weren't so happy about the idea of him dating their daughter. And after a couple racially charged incidents, my mom decided to move us to the big city. Here we are. And what happened for me at that transition, so she timed it very well. I was going into middle school, he was going into high school, so academically it was a good transition time for us. I moved here and discovered I wasn't black enough. I found out what it meant to be mixed. I had been kind of briefly told about that as a child. I was taught to understand and embrace that I was both black and indigenous. And my mom did as much as she could do from Burlington to expose me to those cultures. So we took trips to the Dells, and I got involved mainly through church. I got involved with what was happening at that time called Winnebago, now Ho-Chunk Nation. And we took some excursions into Milwaukee. But basically, I really got here and I realized that there's differences within the black community, and that black isn't just black. I now am the proud mother of 5 kiddos. Yeah. And you say, wow, but then there's another 5 that I've kind of taken on. So I've parented 10 kids through Madison School District. Right now, my kids that are remaining, I have an entering junior. I have one that will be an 8th grader and one that will be a 6th grader. And my focus today isn't necessarily going to be specifically this historic kind of journey. I really want to talk more about kind of the political atmosphere, racial atmosphere, and the impacts that the legacy of slavery still really holds for black families, for our experience with white teachers, and the fact that a lot of our curriculum doesn't really address that in a way that feels meaningful or that actually can tend to alienate students. So that's enough about me for a moment. You kind of got a brief of what I do in the community. I could probably spend the whole 90 minutes boring you or regaling you, depending on your opinion, with my busyness. Just to really give it a base level, I feel like in order to change the society we live in, we have to be part of that change. And so any place that I feel like my voice can lend power to the situation, I tend to lend my voice. which means that I get involved in many different things that folks might not feel like are necessarily related. I'm active in parent engagement in the schools. I have an minority, multicultural business organization that I've started, and we are allowing opportunities for vending and professional development with a focus on what would be considered marginalized or minority entrepreneurs. And I do some presenting and public speaking around topics of diversity, and also I have that volunteer hat, so I'm always kind of working in all these different realms. So if we can just take a second and kind of just start going around, what I'm most interested in is your name, what level of school, so are you middle school, high school teacher, and then how you racially identify. If you wouldn't mind getting us started, Jeff?
I'm Jeff Bradshaw. I'm the Director of International Education here at Madison College, and I won't be able to stay the whole morning, but I'm one of the co-hosts for this event.
And you racially identify as?
Thank you.
Racially identify as white, but socially active.
I'm Susan. I teach in Madison schools at high school, and I racially identify as white American as well. Having grown up Jewish in a 100% Christian area, and I don't consider being Jewish a race, but yet it is racializing.
Thank you.
I'm Mary Smith, and I teach at a private high school here in Madison, and I identify as white. I'm Kim Mayer. I teach at a alternative high school in Madison for pregnant and parenting students, and I'm white.
Denise Shager. I teach in Waukesha, 7th grade world geography. Grew up in Waquanago, which is not very far away from Burlington, and at the time, very small town. Now it's growing. I identify as white. I'm very interested in hearing what you have to say today.
Thank you.
I'm Gina, and I also teach in Waukesha at the middle school, literacy, and grew up in on the south side of Milwaukee, and identify as white also.
My name is Beth. I teach 9th through 12th grade German and global education courses. I'm white, but I lived in Germany for 17 years of my adult life. So culturally, I have, I'm not completely American, I would say.
Thank you.
I'm Mei Lan Liu. I'm from China. I teach the students from Africa and Central Asian countries to come to our country to study Chinese language and culture. And also I do the research related with the multicultural, multilingual in commercial business area in our country. Okay, thank you. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Oh, and I guess also we asked what you racially identify as.
You mean who are the
Your racial identity.
I'm the Chinese Han.
Thank you.
I'm Sarah Akinazi. I teach 5th grade in Malta Public Schools, and I identify as white.
Thank you.
I'm Lalita Duperon. I teach at UW-Madison, and I identify as white.
My name's Sandra Alvarado. I'm Mexican. It's a very interesting question because I have this conversation with a friend all the time. I identify as Mexican, but also as white. And one of my biggest frustrations is I grew up in an all-white community, always pretty much my whole life, the only person of color. And so I feel white. I know how to be white. I am white, I understand white, but I'm also Mexican, and so I identify as both, and I feel like in white, not here, but oftentimes in white environments, when I'm the only one, and I'm almost always the only one, I feel it. I feel like I'm different, I'm the only one, but when I'm with, like, my Mexican side of the family, I'm not like them, And so it's that very classic, but it's very real, not ever really belonging anywhere. So,
Kindred spirits, yes,
yeah,
understand
I hear
that.
you totally when you talk like that.
Thank you. And what age group, I'm sorry, are you teaching?
I've been high school for the last decade, I'm going to be moving to middle school next year.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And for the last 4 years, going on 5, primarily African American students. And I'm sorry, see, now that's, I
Your
always
choice,
think, I thought,
absolutely your choice.
no, but I thought it was a sign of respect, and so like this is, I'm hearing
We
this
can unpack
new
that a
today,
little.
so.
Yeah.
Understood.
Brad Smutty, I teach at Plymouth High School, and I identify as white.
Thank you. And then in the back of the room, we didn't hear from the two of you. Quietly thought you were going to get out of there.
Well, I'm Alberto. I'm also one of the co-organizers teaching UW, and white, but also Mexican. So I hear what you're saying, and I feel that.
I'm Lijo Lopez. Had I grown up in the United States, I would have been historically fabricated as white. And so in the present, I'm historically fabricated as brown. I feel Caribbean, I connect with the ocean, and I will be talking with you later this afternoon.
I really like that. You were the perfect person to end with. I love that. You would think I planned that. So without going back around the room, I'm wondering if the responses would have been different if I asked what you ethnically identify with. And the reason I pull that out is because for me, race is really a social construct that a lot of times has been used as a box holder, a placekeeper, definitely social hierarchy to identify who and where we belong. And it's also definitely been one of the great dividers. I find it interesting that, like I said, I'm guessing that the response would have been different and a bit more diverse had I asked about ethnic backgrounds. Because we tend to do this whitewash, and I call it whitewash because so many folks came here with very proud histories and connections to their cultures and have become white. Even to the degree of two folks in the house identifying as Mexican and yet also white. And for me, I think there's some keys in that idea of breaking down the us versus them mentality that I think even in the best meaning and well-intentioned places can be this big barrier. I say that because me and my mother, who I kind of already talked about interracial adoption, have been unpacking racial issues for the last 2 years. It's been our race-relating years. And it started because during the Trump administration's campaigning, we came to some very clear spots. I was very much aware of what making America great could mean, and it frightened me. And she felt, being raised a Republican by Republicans, that it was an overreaction. My response to police brutality has been very racialized. As a black woman, raising black children, and in relationships with black men, I've experienced that real life threat and situation. And I was also raised by a white or Polish police officer. So I've also grew up knowing police officers in softball and at the bar and coming by the house and actual real life people. I get to that to kind of talk about and think about interpersonal relationships around race. So when you have black students that enter into your space, whether you have a class that's primarily, and what I'm guessing in this class is either few or none, they're coming to you with a lot of baggage, just like any other student, but they're also coming to you already feeling alienated at the door. Having grown up in the school district here, where I did see other brown students, I remember coming into the middle school classroom for the 3 days that we spent watching Brits. And I remember feeling very awkward and pain, and I hold that trauma. When we learned about the dinosaurs, every time, no matter what age group, when we learned about pterodactyls, I spent a week getting called pterodactyl. There was no trauma assessed to that, right? Oh, fun. The silence in the class when we didn't unpack what was happening in Brits. has lasted. I call those docutraumas. The most recent popular docutrauma being the one about the boys in New York, right? Until they're seen or when they see us. I have no interest in those type of shows, and to me it relates back to kind of the whole curriculum that I've experienced. Pre-enslavement curriculum that I wasn't purposely identified to relate to. So the Egyptian dynasties and things that were presented to me but from a white perspective and not in a way to uplift and empower me. The only time I remember feeling like the curriculum was directly related to me as a black student was the deficit-based, the sad, tragic stories of slavery, the small amount of time that we spent discussing the civil rights movement, and even in that, the focus on perseverance and resilience, and not the focus on empowerment. I have a letter that I want to read to you all that I came across as I was thinking about what I wanted to say in this space. And it's on a site called Teaching Well White. And it's a letter to white teachers of my black children. Has anybody, had a chance to read that? Okay. Dear white teachers of my black children, I am a black mom. I know it's sometimes hard to decide whether to say black or African American. I used to identify as African American because I loved hearing the reference to my ancestral homeland in my description of myself. But then to say African American reduces the majestic continent of Africa down to the status of a country. Africa is not a country, and so I now identify as a black woman. I identify here specifically as a black mom because I have 2 children who are now in high school. Raising them to be inquisitive, informed adults with a strong sense of identity and agency is an essential part of my life. I am also an educator, so I understand the deep importance of guiding and shaping all of our children. I am also intimately aware of all the cultural complexities surrounding our work. I know, too, that we have a long way to go before we're even close to treating all of our students equitably. This is why I'm writing to you today. I have much to say about what I wish you had been able to do for my children when they were in elementary and middle school classrooms, and what I hope you will do for all children of color entering your classrooms. Because I am an educator, I know well what you, or at least the vast majority of you, learned in your pre-K-12 education and your teacher prep program. I also know what you didn't learn. As you grew up, you were most likely taught in school and at home that Abraham Lincoln was the great emancipator, that it was acceptable, right even, to refer to the people of the global majority as minorities, and that communities with higher percentages of black families are in need of saving. As a teacher, you most likely did not receive ongoing professional development about race and education in America. You're likely to have a vague understanding about issues of diversity and equity and inclusion with insufficient understanding of culturally responsive teaching and learning. On the other hand, you most likely received extensive training on implementation of state and national education standards, new curricular initiatives, and how to improve the standardized test scores. In recent years, you might have received a professional development about social-emotional learning, but you'll have done so without exploring the critical socio-political considerations that are essential to strengthening your ability to teach well across race, class, and gender. In high school, college, and your teacher prep program, you no doubt were taught something about race in America, but it's highly unlikely that you learned the truth about black experience. It's likely, for instance, that you've been taught little to nothing about the pre-enslavement contributions of black people to the world, the horrors and impact of centuries of enslavement, post-emancipation Jim Crow laws and practices, and the many ongoing racially based systemic injustices such as mass incarceration, housing discrimination, wealth disparities, and lack of equal access to quality education, healthcare, and more. I didn't learn about these things in school either, but thankfully, my parents made sure I learned about these important aspects of American life and history that are absent from the textbooks and teachers' guides. Because it's unlikely that you learned about all of these things in school or in your home. It's even more unlikely that you teach about these matters now. I know that those of you who taught my children when they were younger didn't necessarily teach them about these issues. But here's the thing. They truly wanted to hear from you. We have talked extensively about these matters at home. But my children's school experiences would have been far more valuable if you would have introduced them to the lives and works of Ellen and William Craft, Katherine Johnson, Louis Hayden, Ida B. Wells, and Dunbar Basie. They wanted to hear you tell them the truth about the Black Panther Party, the reasons behind the FBI's surveillance of Martin Luther King Jr., the painful facts about Columbus' experience in the Americas, and the meaning of Juneteenth. And they didn't want to hear just a few tidbits about this essential and complex aspects of American life in February, just because it was Black History Month. What my children needed from you in school, what all students of color need from you in school, is a much deeper understanding of racial history and ongoing racial matters. If you are to teach them well, teach them as I know you want to teach them. You need deeper cultural knowledge and skills. If, for instance, you teach a social studies unit on immigration, and you have your students present about the countries of their ancestors, Black children need you to think more deeply about how this assignment feels for them. One of the many things Black Americans lost as a result of the nation's involvement in enslavement is the knowledge of which African countries our ancestors came from. Although we now have some helpful information from Ancestor DNA, I, for instance, can't say for sure whether my African ancestors were Nigerian, Senegalese, Ghanaian, Congolese, Beninese, or from the Ivory Coast. And because we didn't have access to this information when my children were in elementary school, they ended up focusing only on their European heritage because our white ancestors are a lot easier to trace. This can also be a tough and painful assignment for other students of color as well, especially for First Nations people whose ancestral stories are overlooked by misrepresented in the textbook versions of American history. My guess is that you didn't think about all this in planning the unit. Going forward, I hope you will. Because you were entrusted to partner with me in the education of my children. I wanted you to be curious about them with the same intensity with which you have them stand to pledge allegiance to the flag. I wanted you to wonder how they felt when they saw Mount Rushmore or the face of Andrew Jackson on the $20 bill they handed you with their field trip permission slip. I wanted you to wonder how they felt in your class after hearing about yet another unarmed black life erased from this world by police brutality. All because the melanin we see as so beautiful looks like danger to others. Do you know how it felt for my children when you didn't say anything about racial injustices at the time of those occurrences? Do you know how it feels for your Black students today? If your school is anything like the schools where I taught, you'll be expected to interact with your students' families at open houses, conferences, and literacy and math nights. On those nights, families are expected to come to school and are often judged harshly if they don't. I want you to think about this. Think about why are you judging them harshly, and what assumptions are you making? During parent-teacher conferences, you will most likely not have a lot of time, So you'll probably default to talking at families about their children instead of engaging in dialogues with families as partners. I know it's hard. I've been there too. But I'm asking you now, when it's time for conferences, when families show up to engage in conversation with you about the most precious people in their lives, please don't see your contract as a limitation. Use these moments as opportunities to connect, learn, and share. As you well know, the dominant culture in the United States tries to suppress conversations on race. There are numerous reasons for this, most of them related to the maintenance of the power status quo. I'm asking you to help break this damaging practice, especially among adults in your school. There are certain conversations that take place in teachers' lounges about students and their families that I find both infuriating and heartbreaking. Too often, teachers are silent in the face of racial, prejudicial, biased, or stereotypical comments. I know it's uncomfortable to confront a colleague. I want you to consider, however, how uncomfortable it makes my family and all other families of color to know that there are people who we've entrusted with the care and teaching of our children who think of them as less than, less important, less worthy of our love and attention. When that moment arises next time, and it will arise, I want you to think of how uncomfortable the students are in that teacher's classroom. I want you to speak up on their behalf. If a colleague says something derogatory about a child or that child's family, you must speak up. As Desmond Tutu said, if you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. My children are in high school now, and I've had the privilege of participating in advanced placement and honors courses in school. They have scored at proficient and advanced levels on standardized tests. They are amazing young people, and they have worked hard. But none of these accomplishments make them exceptional or in any way better than their schoolmates who have not had these same opportunities. It also doesn't make my husband and me exceptional or any better than the families of their schoolmates. Please consider the access and opportunities that are available to all students in your schools. Our job, if we are doing it right, is to celebrate every child where they are and move them forward with skill, love, courage, and grace. In a nation that claims to believe in educating all children to become engaged citizens, this practice of failing so many students of color, or tracking them based on implicit bias, or pushing them out of schools, or driving them into criminal justice systems, or ignoring them in hopes they'll simply drop out. This adult behavior in schools perpetuates inequitable systems. Finally, I know it's tempting to think that because you teach in a school with a high percentage of Black students, racism isn't an issue for you. Please know that proximity doesn't equal awareness. That would be like a male teacher saying, I can't be sexist because I have female students. Know too that racial colorblindness isn't really a thing. While it's right to treat children equitably, it's also important to understand how race shapes lives in a racist system. I want to repeat that. It's also important to understand how race shapes lives in a racist system. We all breathe in the smog of oppression, and the only way to expel it is to read, listen, reflect, ask questions, and become better as a result of what we've learned. I'm here asking you as an educator to help lead the way. By improving equity in schools, by becoming truly inclusive learning communities with an effective anti-racist curriculum, we improve both individual lives and equity and justice in society. I'm here for you, and I'm rooting for you. As Lila Watson said, your liberation is bound with mine. With love, respect, and hope, Africa Afeni Mills, a Black educator mom.
What website is that from?
I can share with Bradley. There's it's Teaching While White, and it's a blog and a podcast. And this was just at the end of last month that this was put out. Whew. Right. that, first of all, any quick feedback, anything that this brought up for anyone, anything specific that it kind of touched on or made you think of? Anybody that's willing to share? Thank you.
I love the idea of how comfortable are your students? Are they uncomfortable, are they comfortable? And we had a speaker yesterday who had a professor who would always check in at the end of a unit and say, why does this matter? And I connect with that very quickly because I'm now in a school. I've never been in a school where I've had more than one, and I say this broadly, one population. So I have always taught in either African American schools or in Hispanic schools. And I apologize for any offense on terms, but in big picture, that's how I looked at it. And so yes, you have the different countries and you have the different families, et cetera, but I'm now in a school where I teach, I think I had 17 different countries in my school, in my classroom, just my classroom is here. So it's so having these conversations are so critical, but what I'm sitting here reflecting on while I'm listening to that letter is, although I did my best all year long to make them comfortable and allow them to tell their stories or what they've been told, those stories made other children uncomfortable. And that me understanding I need to go to another level to not only let kids tell their story, but then let other students or allow the space for students to have that next conversation of, are you uncomfortable, how are you? So just understanding that I have to do that next level with them. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Because one, you touched on a part that resonated with me as well. As a mother, there's been countless times that, to the point that I'm now looking into seriously homeschooling my kids. Because so much of our after school is caught up in unpacking trauma and not talking about academics. When I asked my child the proverbial, what'd you do at school today? I'm met with feedback about student behavior that they felt unprotected or unsupported to navigate, teacher behavior that they also felt unprotected and unable to navigate. And we always find allies. So it's not ever to say that there's this criminalization or villainization of teachers that I think is a popular thing right now, at least in our district. On the way here, I had the pleasure of picking up and dropping off my 19-year-old who's out in the world and has a car failure, right? Go figure, 19-year-old. And I asked her, so I'm getting ready to talk to some teachers, and we're going to talk about some of the impacts of racial history and current racial status in the classroom. And what, as a student, having just graduated, what would you say to this group? And she said some interesting things. She said that they should all think of all their students as they would of any other child that they care about. That seemed fundamental. But she also said to remind them that not only are they helping to raise the next generations of doctors and community leaders, but feminists. And I said, let's unpack that. What is that? And she said, I think about how many times I was in class and kids came in class and acted a fool. And the first response of the teacher was to get them out of the class as a distraction. And in the school district here, which if any of you have been following the news, that involves police. So right now there's police in each one of the schools, and when kids are deemed as having behavior issues, security and police are who they call to deal with that. And she said she remembers a kid from 6th grade to freshman year that was always the class clown. And she said later in life, which is I think is cute for a 19-year-old, she says, I found out he couldn't read, right? I found out that anytime he thought that he was going to be in a position to have to read, that he acted up because he knew he could count on getting put out of the class. And within getting put out of the class, there was still a social status around his peers that was okay. That he might have been doing all these other things, but that, I mean, we know, teenagers, they glorify, everything glorifies, in my opinion, this gangsterism, this criminalization, until it gets real serious. But she said, had one of those teachers thought, why are you acting this way? And not, how can I make you stop? maybe that child's trajectory would have been different. Maybe he wouldn't have been in juvenile corrections. And so I thought that was kind of profound for my 19-year-old, to say not only are you raising and supporting the next group of leaders, but you also have contact with the next group of felons. That was sad. She also talked about walking into honors classes and immediately being questioned about her status in the class. And I remember that well too, because I was that parent that went to bat for her. Historically, in my life experience for myself and my kids, middle school, the summer between 7th and 8th grade is when the behaviors kick in. That's when I had to deal with curfew issues and talking back a little bit extra than just a stomping off. But the academic checkout was sophomore year. So I sent my kids into high school, the specific daughter, on an honors track. Very bright young lady, very expressive. She excels in writing and reading and critical thinking. And so I deemed that honors track as very doable for her. And I sent her into school, and I got her enrolled into those classes, and we had a little back and forth because she didn't want to have to do the extra work, and she wasn't sure if she could manage it. And then to walk into the classroom space, to be met with 2 other brown children, and to immediately have all 3 of those students question about their status in the class. And even though she stuck to it that first semester, when I finally let her go into the regular English class, and she had then to experience the opposite side with the kids, with the behaviors and the different things that were distracting her. At the end of the day, I always wonder what happens at the end of freshman year, that killed that part of her. Because by junior year, I was no longer trying to negotiate honor classes, I was trying to negotiate attendance. How do I get you to just go? How do I get you to stay there? How do I get you to not say, oh my God, I don't want to go to school today. Why do I have to go to school today? What happened that took my enthusiastic, accomplishing middle schooler and took them into what should have been their opportunity to start exploring who they were in a deeper sense, and made them want to retract and pull into their community? And when I say their community, I mean their peers, their other black and brown peers, and to stay at home. I don't have the answer to that yet.
I don't know who it was that sent out those questions, but one of the questions was about your experience, and I wrote about how when I was in high school, there was just no expectation. There was just none. And nobody told me about college, nobody told me that was an opportunity, there was just nothing. And I didn't even explore college until my friends started applying for college. And so when my son grew up in that same community, and I could see that he was very bright, always tested 96, 98 percentile, very bright young man, but I could see the same thing happening. They were not going to choose him for the gifted and program. They were not choosing him for leadership things. They were not, there's selections, teachers select. And I could tell already he was never going to be one of those selected ones. And that the same thing was going to happen to him. I did pull him out, and he schooled from home from 7th grade on, because I thought, I don't want that to happen to him. So it's unfortunate, but I understand.
So one of those community hats I'm wearing right now is facilitating a community conversation around the concept of cooperative homeschooling from a Pan-African lens. The interest level right now we'll see, because Facebook likes and intends to vote never equals the people in the seats. But from what I'm seeing, it's a very popular topic. And I think that we should all be concerned when folks who are not educators, who have chosen not to go into that field, feel like they're better off figuring it out at home than sending our kids to the professionals. And I, again, want to go back to this emphasizing this is not a villainization of teachers, because individually, I'm looking into your eyes. I'm giving eye contact. I don't feel outed, othered, or otherwise in the space. But it doesn't go unnoticed, and I will forever be programmed to count the brown folks. So my kids do that too. They're well aware of who they are in every space and how they perceive they're being treated because of it. So another story about one of my kiddos. My 11-year-old is the sweetest little dude. And I know everybody thinks their sons are the sweetest, but mine's the sweetest. And 2 years ago, he was struggling with reading, and he was in a class with himself. You know, he had special assistants, and so he had one teacher with 2 kiddos. It was him and a white young man. And consistently, he came home and complained about thinking his teacher was racist. Now let me tell you, racist is this thing he has right now. So anytime anybody points anything out that has to do with anything ethnic, cultural, or otherwise, you're a racist, right? That's this new word. But so every time he throws that out, we have to unpack it. We have to figure out what does that really mean, because I can't have you using this word willy-nilly, but I also need to support you when you feel like it's happening. And his perception of racism was that the teacher displayed more patience with the young white boy. She gave him 2 pieces of candy instead of 1 when he did well. And he was keeping track of all of those slights. So later when we would have our teacher-parent conversations, and she said, I just can't get him to engage. I just can't get him to focus. I don't think we're making a connection. I said, you know, you're right. I'm glad you realize it, because you're not making a connection. And I'm not calling you a racist, but I'm gonna tell you what my, at that time, 9-year-old perceives is that you're racist. Let's unpack and talk about, why does my 9-year-old feel like he's being racially profiled in a 3-person setting? And she was aghast. I don't know how he could think this. I treat all of my students the same. Clearly, something's happening, because I didn't send my son to school thinking he needed to count how many pieces of candy were given. I didn't send him to school expecting anything other than good treatment from white folks. Remind you, his grandma, who is a stellar grandma, is a white woman. He's grown up knowing love, affection, guidance, discipline, all of the things that are part of the family value structure from a white woman. He's watched me bow to that same authority, that same, in my moments of needing my mommy, that's who I go to. So the concept of dealing with whiteness is not foreign or adversarial for him. And yet in that space, his constant response to me, his feedback whenever he met, was he felt like he was being discriminated against. And he internalized that, and he carried it with him, and it caused him a distrust of that woman, and it's caused him a distrust of other teachers that come into his space, because she was very nice and pleasant to us. But he can't get past that. He perceived that and he felt that. So he'll carry that. The thought that because it's not being offered in school, and when I talk about it, I'm talking about education from a Black perspective. When my kids go to school and they come back and they talk about any of the things that they're being taught in class, there's an additional piece that happens in our household that has to do with viewing it from our lens, that has to do with deconstructing what you've been taught and kind of re-looking and thinking about it. I bring this up to mention that concept of not talking about it, of not bringing it up. The letter talks about what impression you're leaving on your students when you don't address it. You leave the impression that you don't care, you don't acknowledge it. As an adult, I know it's a really, really hard conversation. We struggle. I commend you, who just spoke, because you said 2 racial identifiers and then said, I apologize if that's not, I forget exactly how you put it, but I apologize if it was offensive. I think that, no, I know that if we all take the space to go away from impact and intention from this at ends kind of a place, right? And we look at it from a judgment of open-mindedness, open-heartedness, then we can start having those really hard conversations in a much more freeing way. I put on a workshop to folks from a volunteer management lens and nonprofit lens that has to do with welcoming diversity, and then at the end it says comfortably. And that came from spending a lot of time in diversity workshops, walking out feeling shell-shocked. What adjectives and pronouns to use, what's the right term for this, and you get inundated, and then, oh, don't start talking about microaggressions, and then you realize everything I do is a microaggression. and thinking, this is not gonna help us, right? I walked out, literally last summer, I walked out of a class, and I thought, I usually go to these diversity classes to kind of pick up on other people's, what's the trend, what's being shared, and to kind of hone my own craft. I rarely go there expecting to be given any really new nuggets. I picture myself kind of walking that lane. And for me to walk out of that class and go, right? I thought, what about the 50-year-old white woman sitting next to me who proclaimed that she didn't meet a person of color until she was in her 20s? Or what about the person who just doesn't have the exposure, hasn't had the education? What the heck did they just leave this space feeling? And I thought, scared, afraid. And I understand that that's why sometimes we stay quiet. But I also know that kids and their emotions are much more unstable usually than adults. I say usually because we all know there's some unstable adults. And I think about at work when some of the more recent really media spectacularized events have taken place. Police-involved shootings and different things like that. The very racially charged news. And I think about how it felt to walk into work, primarily white folks, and to have no one say anything about it. And to know that I carried it so very deeply that it made it hard for me. It makes it hard for me to engage with folks. It made it hard for me to smile in some circumstances. Because the reality is that could have been my son, my father, my brother, my whomever. So all of this goes to say, be brave. Have the conversation. Another nugget from my 19-year-old was the teachers that she remembers and the teachers that made an impact on her were the ones that got personal. The ones that took a moment to find out who she was. Was she the oldest? Was she the youngest? Was she the middle child? What did that mean? Who took those moments to identify that she was a young black woman. And what did that mean for her in that space, in that moment? And that doesn't mean you have to spend the whole class talking, having this social justice conversation or unpacking everyone's deep emotions, because we all know that that rabbit hole goes deep. But it does mean that you do things that you would, if you had a loss in your life, would you want me to know about that loss and just gloss over it and not acknowledge it? Would you want me to spend the whole day harping on it and bringing it up? I feel like you'd want me just to acknowledge it, tell you I feel you, I'm here for you, and then move on, right? Go on with the business of the day. If I'm in this class to learn about algebra, then let's learn about algebra. But don't expect me to walk into the class ready for algebra if I just woke up this morning and found out that a student was brutalized at a school in my community and it was racially charged. Don't skip over it. Be brave enough to bring it up. Be brave enough to offer whatever support lies in the school, even if it's not you. Acknowledge that it happens. Now, I tend to get stuck on the focus of black-white lens because so much of my life has been black-white lens. But this struggle is felt by so many other people. I'd say that right now, 2 weeks ago, there was the announcement that ICE was coming back out and they were rounding folks up. What did that mean for your students? What does that mean for all of your students? And did you feel like you could address it? Those are those unspoken pieces that, when spoken, change the whole narrative for your students. Because they're talking about it amongst themselves, they're definitely talking about it at home, and they're surrounded by it. And to come into a space that's supposed to be welcoming, secure, and an educational space and not have it discussed or brought up feels like intentional, it feels like you don't care, and not necessarily do they always have the capacity to understand that that's a hard conversation for all of us, especially because, so I was reading a little bit about what folks had to say about the current impacts of slavery. And one of the things that came up is the perception that nobody other than black folks is worried or considers all the time blackness. And what that meant was that we see everything through that lens. And I said, you know what, that's right. I do. I assess so many things in my life through that lens. of my blackness in this space? Are there other people of color in this space? Are people making eye contact with me? Are they looking away? Are there going to be these different expectations? Are there going to be these different assumptions? Is there the assumption that when I say I have 5 kids, that all their dads are different, or that I'm estranged from the fathers, or that they were mistaken and that I didn't know enough about birth control, or just all of these things that I have to unpack. And my kids, they go into school and they have to unpack those same things. The assumption that if I'm not available for a teacher conference, or I opt out of coming to one of the many parent opportunities at school, that it's because I'm disengaged, or I have some kind of drug addiction, or there's all these different negative ideas, and we do it to ourselves. I was part of parent engagement programming, what we call here PEGs, parent empowerment groups, and I would sit in groups of other black mothers and hear them demonize other black mothers for not being in a space. And they must not be engaged, and this is what's wrong. And I thought, well, what about when my oldest child got into middle school and I knew that I could leave them in charge of my house, and what that meant for me is I could go get another job and have the capacity in our household widen. It didn't mean I wasn't engaged, because I was on top of those kids. I knew what their homework was. I'm the mom that emails you and expects you to email me back. I'll call you and give you my cell phone. I make friends with the secretary at the school because I know she sees my kid when they're late and misbehaving. I make friends with the security guards because I know they can intervene, and they all got my text number. And they use it. And but the perception that because I wasn't in that space at that time that was designated by the school for me to be there and show my engagement, that I wasn't engaged. And the way that impacted the way my kids were talked to. The way that the tutor, instead of tutoring and forcing my son to work out the problem, instead pitied him and gave him low expectations and did the work for him. And little did she know that he was a smooth talker, and that's how he got his algebra done. It was never that he couldn't do it. She didn't find that out until I was like, stop doing his work. Make him do his work. Because I don't do that for him. And then, oh my goodness, that D went up to a C, went up to an A in a couple class periods because what? He wanted to be eligible for basketball. He wanted his cell phone back. Is that racism? Is that bias that she assumed? That he was coming from a broken home and that I didn't have time to help him with his math, and that she needed to help him with it because he couldn't understand it? I call it, I find that comes from usually the best meaning folks, and I usually blame some of what she talked about, right? The teaching. If you didn't grow up next to a black family and interact with that family, and know that one black family and learn about all the different dynamics in that family, and then you're likely to believe those stories that you see in the news, those narratives, the constant deficit talk about my community, right? The house disparities, the income disparities, all these different things that are racialized. And while that's all very well and true, kids coming from upper class, middle class black families are struggling in your classes too. They're not graduating as well. If anything, the more engaged the parents are, the more they're educating their children, the more frustrating they're finding the curriculum. When I talk to my kids about the Black Panthers and they go to school and they don't hear about it, they're wondering, what the heck? When I talk to my kids about July 4th versus Juneteenth, and it's not being acknowledged, what the heck? And then the expectation that they're to read Mice of Men, and they're to read all these books that throw the N-word out and are told that this is literal history and that we need to break this down and talk about it in class. No fail. Every one of my kids that's been a freshman has refused to read the book. I've had to advocate for them, and 2 out of 3 times we've been successful and got another book. But I've always had to take the steps. I've always had to educate my child to feel like they could advocate for themselves. And they were always seen as a troublemaker. It was always an issue before it became a resolution. It's not a curriculum change though. And I'm not the only family that's had that issue. And so with that, I challenge you all, I know later you're gonna get to the curriculum piece. I challenge you to go into that thinking outside the constructs of just making kids aware, of just adding that piece to your curriculum. And to go to the interpersonal piece of it and challenge yourself to think, if I was being presented this history of myself, What would I need from my teacher to feel safe in this space? What would I need to have acknowledged in this moment to make it okay? And you have to think about that for all your students, because as you break down even just what you're here to kind of talk about, the foundation of sugar plantations and slavery, how is that making your brown students feel? How is that making your white students feel? How is that making the classroom interact with each other? And then devise a way to deal with that. And I'm sorry I don't have this magic wand to tell you each, this is what you do and this will make it better. But I can say that being brave enough to discuss it and acknowledge it can be enough. The things that come out of that same now 11-year-old's mouth about how he views race in the world are amazing to me. That naive, open-minded, being able to see the world as a very plain, non-political thing. There's so much value in that. And allowing him to explain that and have that conversation with his peers could be all that you really need to learn for yourself. It doesn't always have to be a direct lesson about Harriet Tubman. And don't get me started about how there's like 5 people that we choose to, look at and that's it. We have to deal with this collective guilt and this collective victimization. This idea that all black people are suffering and all white people are guilty. And to act like that's not happening is an injustice, because it is. It's happening in every space and every moment and every thought of a person that's been minoritized and marginalized. We're all constantly thinking about how our race affects the situation. And I try not to speak for other folks, but I think anyone who doesn't acknowledge that their brown or blackness is leading the way into a room isn't being honest. You're negotiating it in your own culture. You're negotiating it when you're at other cultures. If you replace Brad in a classroom full of all black students, you'd be aware, right? We're not culturally colorblind, and nor should we be. We need to take the time to acknowledge and give space and voice to all of that. And we need to take a look at our curriculum and realize where it's not doing that. And then speak to it. Not just brush past it. It's not your charge, each of you, to recreate the curriculum, because there's rules around there, right? You don't necessarily even have all that say. From my understanding, you guys are kind of given a route, and this is the route you go, and there's some flexibility within how you present it, but there's some expectations placed upon you. Within that, there's still that responsibility to think deeper, to challenge yourself, to challenge your students, and to create an open and safe space. So, thinking about slavery and the end of slavery. The end of slavery was really just the beginning for a quest of democratic equality. So while the trauma and the horrendous conditions of slavery are said to be many, many years behind us, the fact is that as a race, black folks have been fighting against that and continue to. When we look at numbers like our black children being arrested 10 to 1, when we look at the numbers of us not graduating, when we look at all these different disparity numbers that came out in the Race to Equity big report, or the things that are still being talked about when we talk about healthcare, incarceration, wealth, pretty much all indicators of a thriving, healthy life. And we see folks at the bottom of that. You have to realize that the fight goes on, and it continues, and it's in every space entered. So being culturally sensitive is great. Learning to be culturally aware is fantastic. Going and developing a vast knowledge of African contributions and African American contributions and being able to see other sides of history and representing those is fabulous. But always remembering that it's a constant battle that's being waged internally, externally. I think that It gives me so much more patience for the kids I encounter in the world. Looking at things from a trauma-informed lens. Instead of looking at a behavior and saying, I need to end it, look at it and figure out what's behind it. Is it something I said or didn't say when I welcomed students into my class? Something like what I call soft skills. So displaying awareness of diversity. Ways that that's done are introducing yourself and using your pronouns. Indicates to the class that you're aware of that as an issue and that you're receptive and open to others giving you their pronouns. Displaying multicultural art in your classroom is a way to say, I see you and I acknowledge you. It doesn't even involve an awkward situation. It's just simply representation. Those are some really easy ways to start off in the right direction. So, another thing that I found was the idea that self-limiting patterns of behavior are the reason for all of those disparities. We can't get away from the fact that there's high levels of crime, that some of our black and brown children are the ones that are being disruptive, that there's not a teacher-based reason always for the failures academically. We can't get away from that, but we can trace that back to what I just talked about, this always constant internal and external battle. If I'm tasked with learning algebra, and I go back to algebra because I'm not a math person, and so you present me with a bunch of numbers, and I've been known to even look at things and go, that looks like math, I don't want to do it, even if it's not math. Like the periodic table, anything that looks like I have to remember a formula. Ask me how to figure out percent off, I've got that. Truly, truly. But sending me into an algebra class where I'm tasked with learning something I'm disconnected from. And I say this because algebra and Spanish are where I find my students have always had the most behavior issues. And as I've talked to teachers in our district, it seems like a theme that black and brown children struggle in those two classes. And so I think, why is that? Well, because you're asking them to do a difficult task in a hostile environment around a bunch of stress and trauma that's going unaddressed. So on your worst day, you woke up and the dog tore up some paper in the front room, and the coffee machine went on the blink, and your husband's cranky because that happened, and you go out to the car, and you're almost on low, and you're driving, and the guy ahead of you is going really slow and won't turn, and you're honking your horn, and you're agitated, and you pull into the school, and you walk in, and the kids are loud and obnoxious, and you get to your class, and the kids are filing in, and here comes so-and-so, and they're always late, and they're loud, and their pants are down, and they're on their phone, and you're thinking, I can't wait to get out of school. What about the kid who woke up and hit the bus, was on the bus, and had to listen to violent implications, gang banging, cussing, drug talk, got to school, walked in the gates of the school, and was met by the security guard, was given a suspicious look, was walking down the hall, and constantly having to pull those pants up, and being told, and giving all these indicators that it was not enough. And he walked into your class, and he's the kid that's 5 minutes late, and he's loud, and he's on his phone, and he sits down, and now you want to talk to him about math. How prepared are either of you for that space? What could we have done to change your disposition? What could we do to change his? A lot of times I think that we think we can't do anything to change his disposition. But as a black woman in my community, I know that those are the kids who, once I've made the connection, are the ones that seek me out. And it's been as simple as saying, how are you doing today, young man? And not saying, pull up your pants, get off the phone, why are you doing this, why are you doing that? Not commenting on any of that, and just saying, how are you doing today, young man? And I say that because at the Goodman Center, we have alternative high school programs. And no fail, every semester we get a new group of students who have not been successful in traditional classroom settings. Some of them are coming in with bracelet monitoring systems, are court involved. Their parents are to the point where they're just glad their kids are going somewhere to do something about their education. They're not, as our teachers there would call, engaged. They're loud, they're rowdy, they're impressing the girls, they're trying to strut for the fellas. And in the one moment that I look them in their eye and I say, how are you doing today, young man? It quiets. And they go, Fine, thank you. How are you doing today? And it occurred to me the power in the young man. I say young man in my house when they're in trouble, so my kids have a different response. But young man, young lady, addressing them individually in a way that's unexpected, for me has been a powerful motivator. Those are the same kids that the next week are seeking me out when I get off the elevator near their classroom. They're the same kids that are having verbal exchanges that are inappropriate, and they see me walking up and they get a little quieter. And it's not because I've stepped in as a disciplinarian. It's because I stepped in as an individual and treated them as a peer with respect. I ignored his loudness. I ignored his saggy pants, which, oh Lord, it irritates the life out of me. And it's a struggle. I even sometimes have ignored their foul language, or what I perceive as foul language.
Is that more impactful coming from you,
Good
being
question.
black?
So one, I would say
I
that.
regard it as,
Mhm.
oh, you're in my business.
Sure. So, couple things. One, I don't present as culturally black to most black people.
Oh,
So I end up in an other space, but I am still of color, and that's clear.
uh-huh,
So sometimes yes, and sometimes no.
yeah.
But I would also say, I mean, because I've had that conversation. I was recently in Appleton. Perfect example. I was recently in Appleton, and I was amazed that there is like this black community in Appleton, because in my mind it was a very small town, and I assumed there'd be very few of us. And yet still I saw way more black folks there than I do when I walk around Madison, at least in one area congregated. And I said to a fellow, I said, I didn't realize there was this many of us here. He goes, us? What you talking about? I said, black people. Because I forget myself. I truly do. I forget that I do not present as what is considered to be traditionally a black appearance. I think that, yes, there's absolutely that piece of it.
Mm-hmm.
I also think that your bravery in doing it and keep on moving and doing it again is a key to that. Kids want connection to adults.
Yeah.
And of course they prefer and want some connection with other adults of color. But what they're looking for in your space is acceptance and seeing me. Acknowledge me as me. I think that, I mean, I challenge you to try and see what it does. I wish that we could be in email contact so you could say, I said good morning young man or young lady to 7 students today, and this was a response.
Uh-huh.
I find it's a shock factor that I think
Right.
could tend to
I've
work
seen
in
that
your
too.
favor as well.
And then I think, what's my next steps? There's gotta be more community building, so where do I go from there? In a respectful manner, right?
As the 19-year-old said, open the door and I'll walk through it. The teachers that she respects and impacted her are ones that she now reports that she could approach on the street and she knows they've recognized and talked to her. And it wasn't about, one of her favorite teachers probably called me the most about her behaviors and was on her butt the most. And she went through a whole thing, I think she hates me.
Yeah.
But she took the time to find out what it meant for her to be the oldest daughter. And she found out what it meant for her to come home and me be at work. And she found out how she perceived certain things that happened in school. And all of that happened in very short conversations. But you're right, there is definitely, as we talked about, there's that racial line, that barrier. I still say that, and this is with any young person, catching them in those moments of what would have been a disciplinary situation and giving it that moment to just test the water and just say, something else I find is powerful, this is a little trick. What would your mom think? What would your parents think of this behavior? Has also been a powerful one, but that's another conversation for another time. But I advise everyone dealing with my children to throw that out as a first, not a should I call your parent, but what would. So I think that to kind of sum it up is this idea of mutual obligation. Mutual obligation for folks of color to come into spaces with openness, and for folks who identify as white to see the closed offness as a trauma response. And not to look at it as an aggressive or even antagonistic, but to recognize that the baggage that comes along with just existing in this country, in this world, with darker hued skin, is never ending. It never leaves. And it's rarely addressed in a positive manner. I have more I can say, but I feel like I'm at a spot where I want to open it up for a conversation and ask if there's anything that you want me to touch on, any questions that are burning.